Welcome to Energy and Infrastructure from Ulteig, a podcast focused on technology, innovation, policy, and funding. Our podcast discusses the hot issues facing our industry today, interviewing experts, CEOs, elected officials, and the disruptors making an impact in our industry. I'm your host, Aaron Lauinger, Market Director at Ulteig. Welcome to the show. Our thoughts are with the millions of families still struggling after the recent historic winter storms, including our own Texas employees, clients, and partners. As the nation has learned, millions of Texans were without power or clean water for days following unusually harsh winter weather. Politicians have blamed the outages on renewable energy, but that is only 10% of the story. Our focus today is to find out, in the famous words of Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. To help our audience understand and, more importantly, provide key takeaways and solutions, joining me today are a few of my colleagues and experts in the industry. In our virtual studio, we have Sarah Beckman, Program Director at Ulteig. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Aaron. Nice to be here.
Also joining us is our Power Market Director, Brian Sharpe. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And finally, Chad Crabtree, Renewables Market Director. Thanks for being here today, Chad.
You bet.
We've seen a lot of coverage across many media platforms on what happened, and there's no shortage of opinions. Brian, as the Power Market Director, help us understand what exactly happened. We understand that there were blackouts and the repercussions to the Texas community. For the audience, what happened that created this?
First and foremost, we have to acknowledge how this unique polar vortex affected so many people's lives in Texas and beyond. Millions of people found themselves without power and water as overnight temperatures dropped 50 degrees below average. The magnitude of the impact on livelihoods just can't be overstated. In fact, some people lost their lives as a result of this storm, so we have to keep that front of mind as we discuss this topic. Utilities' generation assets weren't prepared for such a unique and rare weather event, resulting in a greater than 74 gigawatt load peak forecast for February 15th and 16th. Compare that with power demand peaks that are historically around 55 gigawatts during the month of February in ERCOT. Energy demand quickly increased, and power couldn't get to it due to bottlenecks in supply as generation assets froze up. That includes all forms of generation too. Initial stories came out about wind turbines freezing up, but everything was impacted from natural gas to coal and even nuclear generation. It was an impact to the grid that came from all forms of generation not being available to meet the demand. And to compound that, there are generic transmission constraints on the system in ERCOT. And let's not forget, it wasn't just electricity and power, but water infrastructure also failed. The fallout from this weather event in Texas continues to develop, and we've seen ERCOT board chair Sally Talberg and 4 other board members resign from their posts. Deanne Walker, the chair of the Public Utility Commission of Texas, resigned shortly after that. And we're seeing utilities report financial losses to the tune of billions of dollars in the wake of this storm. Some generation and transmission cooperatives, including some of the largest in the state, have already filed for bankruptcy. More time and information will be required to fully understand all the factors that contributed to this week's failure, but at its core, the key question is how planning processes, market rules, and regulations need to change to ensure that the energy complex is able to cope with rare extreme weather events, particularly as climate change introduces the potential for increased risk for these events. Getting this right will only increase in importance as the degree of variable renewable generation increases, and reliance on gas as a bridge fuel to decarbonize the energy sector also increases.
Help me understand. You talk about the average loads in the month, and you talked about what the peak was, but I got to believe that Texas in the summer, 100 degrees, the humidity, that's probably something that can be produced, though. Isn't the load greater in the summer than it is in the winter?
It is. However, there's planning that goes into the seasonality of the energy needs in a state, and in a market, in an RTO like ERCOT. They plan for those summer spikes, and generation is maintained and operated accordingly. So when you look at winter, several of the assets that would normally operate at full capacity are oftentimes brought down to lower levels for maintenance, even turned off at certain times of the year for the ability to just make sure that they are doing the routine maintenance needed that you can't really do when it's cranking on all cylinders, if you will. The ability to ramp up immediately and quickly for that extreme planning caseload peak example just isn't there. And at its core, there's a couple of key factors I think that we need to think about. For years, there really has been no implementation of a capacity market in Texas. What that means is they haven't really been paying generators to have power ready at these winter months at the volumes that was needed for an extreme event like this. That payment, could include winterizing power generation plants, right?
When you talk about paying utilities to have the capacity, I mean, isn't it an expectation that they provide it? Isn't that what they're there to do? Is that the legislature or the PUC, or is that ERCOT that gets to decide when and how much power is out there?
We're talking about an unregulated utility market. So when you think about that, really the cost drives a lot of the decisions around where you invest and where you put money into the infrastructure of these systems. Like I said earlier, there's not a huge incentive to spend a large or significant upside cost to developing generation when in your mind or your perception, this is a once in 100-year storm potentially. Whether that's true or not, that it really is a 1 in 100-year storm, the probability drives the decision around, do I really need to invest in winterizing my wind turbine blades when that's a 1 in 100-year shot that it's actually going to happen. I was fortunate enough to listen in on a session with one of the FERC commissioners. What she mentioned is if states or regions or RTOs, organizations like ERCOT aren't ready to bring something to them for market design that's going to drive that incentive, then the commission is going to be willing to take action, whether that's under Section 206 or convening power that they haven't leveraged in the past.
Brian, you mentioned frozen wind turbine blades, which I gotta go over to Chad now, our renewables expert here. At the beginning of the podcast, I definitely very conveniently said 10% of the story. Unfortunately, some opportunistic politicians have taken advantage to really push agendas forward. So help us understand that, Chad.
Yeah, look, Aaron, renewables make up a significant portion of the total capacity in the Texas market. We're talking about nearly 40 gigawatts of total installed capacity, and that peak forecasted demand that the Texas storm saw over Monday and Tuesday was about 75 gigawatts. Let's just set the record straight. This isn't about a few turbines with ice on their blades. Renewables held their own, while fossil plants made up the majority of the offline power. Renewables, and namely wind, were reported down less than about 10% of the total generation loss over those couple of days. Now, wind and solar output had been above forecasted levels for most of those 2 days during that storm week. In fact, many solar plants continue to operate throughout that storm above the forecast, likely because, in part, the efficiency of the panels improved greatly in cold weather. So yeah, I think it's really important to talk about. We don't need to spend a lot of time talking about megawatts and gigawatts, but when we talk about the total capacity of wind and solar was down less than 10% of the drop in capacity over that storm for a few parts of the day. I think it's important to understand that and talk about that. I'll also just circle back and maybe just summarize what Brian said, right? ERCOT operates in an energy-only market. They care about low, real-time pricing. There's no incentive for long-term capacity, reserve, availability, or readiness. So it's essentially worked as intended. If the generators don't want to produce, then they don't have to. I think what we should be talking about is what needs to change so that it works, right? So that it works when we have these extreme events. And to Brian's point, yeah, if we're designing for 1 in a 100-year storm, was that truly 1 in 100 years? NERC and FERC put out a report eerily, almost to the day, a decade ago, last year. And they were talking about a similar storm, similar conditions. And they noted that a storm occurrence was more like 1 in every 10 years. So that report had a lot of guidelines, some non-mandatory fixes. There were 200 generators that were down during that storm. It'd be really interesting to see what comes out of policy and regulation in terms of, do we need to change the ERCOT market to go from an energy only to something else? I don't know if it's capacity, all-in capacity, but we likely need to be looking at readiness and availability for major events, and they seem to be happening more often.
Does ERCOT need to connect to SPP and MISO?
Great question that's been debated for many, many years. I think it's interesting to see that ERCOT's neighbors to the east, west, and to the north shipped off megawatts as they could. There's a handful of DC connections that connect SPP and MISO, and their neighbors were able to, even while they were in controlled blackout situations, they were able to supply some to ERCOT.
Sarah, to you, I know that a lot of your key clients as a program director have generation through SPP and MISO, which traditionally are more familiar with the type of weather that we're seeing, and probably actually more extreme weather. So ERCOT isn't all of Texas. It's kind of, what would you say, the bottom 2/3 of Texas. And SPP gets into that, was it the panhandle of Texas, right?
Yep.
Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, across the nation, it was a polar vortex, right? It wasn't just Texas. There's a lot north of Texas, and everything north of Texas were experiencing the same conditions. So why was that different north of ERCOT as opposed to what ERCOT felt?
Sure, there is a very human side of this, and ultimately that's the piece that matters the most. The work that we do, the people that we work with are here to serve our communities, and everything that happened in Texas, the massive impact of what happened over this past week is not lost on any of us. And we are here to work together to really drive positive change and to create a better outcome from this and learn and to better serve those communities. In the Texas Panhandle, as you mentioned, utilities there are part of Southwest Power Pool, or SPP. The extreme cold weather was experienced by certainly all of Texas and a much larger portion of the United States, and that created energy deficiencies on SPP system or everywhere, right? And those deficiencies actually led SPP to initiate rolling blackouts. So they too saw planned outages on their system, but they were able to better manage their grid. SPP actually operates across 17 central and western states, and they operate in both the eastern and western interconnections. So they have a lot of experience working across a broad range of states, different kinds of climates. So as an example, Xcel Energy is one of those utilities that operates in the panhandle of Texas. They are no stranger to cold weather, being headquartered in Minneapolis. And what they did to prepare for this weather event was they readied crews at the time to make sure they could restore power quickly as issues arose on their system, right? You can't design for everything, and it's important to have those crews at the ready to deploy when there are issues on the system and power needs to be restored. Secondly, they were able to bring all of their generation online. So they saw this coming, they saw these winter storms coming, they looked at the forecast, and they were able to spin up all of their generation to help mitigate and also help provide extra generation to the system. They also work well with their customers to remind them of energy saving tactics that you can employ at the household level, right? Keeping your house at 68 degrees versus 72 degrees. And if a large number of people are doing that, that actually helps the system. And the most important part here, I think, is there was this winter storm in Texas about 10 years ago. And Xcel Energy invested in hardening their grid and designing for that resiliency, so they were able to work through a major weather event like this and weather that storm, metaphorically speaking and literally speaking.
So what I'm hearing is the regulated market outperformed the unregulated market, was more prepared and ready and able to provide the service they needed to their client base.
Yeah, and I think it involved a failure on the planning side within ERCOT territory. And what I mean by that is there should be some market design that allows for investment in resilience and reliability. And that might be a nuanced difference between the markets you're describing there, just the incentive to provide the planning around that resiliency not being there in ERCOT today.
On the transmission planning, I think the other piece that needs to be considered is looking at the grid in the United States as a whole and understanding where you have those transmission constraints, because that's like a pipe. There's only so much water you can push through there. It's the same concept with a transmission line or corridor. You can only pump so many electrons through. So I think another piece of this planning that needs to happen is sitting down and truly understanding and identifying where you have those transmission constraints, so that you can allow the generation to get to where it needs to go.
I'll just add that it's really difficult to model these events. We talk about in the beginning of the conversation, we talked about, the load profile is different in the winter than it is for the summer. You've got heating and cooling of buildings. You have heating and cooling of people's homes. You obviously have electricity generation at the plant level. It's really tough to model these kind of scenarios. You've got load distribution that changes day to day, season to season, even from nighttime to daytime or weekend to weekday. And I think we need to be looking at changing the way we model, changing the sensitivity based on, an increase of recurrence in these kind of events.
Moving forward, do we just wait out every 10 years and hope for the best and maybe do a little more pre-planning right before an event comes, ask the feds to help out with providing that? Or is there more to it? What's the answer? Brian, you've mentioned planning now a couple times. What does it mean to plan? Clearly, plan for what we can, but what's kind of in and around that idea?
Good question, Aaron. I would maybe piggyback on Chad's comment that the modeling is tough to do, but could we leverage some of the agencies out there that have expertise around these topics? And a thought that comes to mind is, at a more macro scale, could an organization like NREL, National Renewable Energies Laboratories, do something to come up with forward-looking models that explain to states and RTOs and regions the value of transmission planning, the value of planning for resiliency of our infrastructure? I don't know, it's just a thought, but to your point of, do we just wait for the next 10-year storm? No, I don't think so. I think there is an opportunity for us to take lessons learned from this event in Texas and provide incentives economically and otherwise that allow for utilities and really infrastructure in general. It's not just power and energy. There were issues with water utilities not being able to supply water. So it's across the board. And can we provide those incentives that allow these infrastructure entities to invest in upfront planning for making sure that their systems are hardened, that their systems are resilient against these extreme weather events, and then we're not just hoping and wishing that the next 10-year event doesn't happen again?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I'm glad you called out the rest of the infrastructure because you're absolutely right. The water treatment plants were freezing. The transportation system was completely in disarray. There were some horrific accidents that occurred due to the lack in the ability to maintain in those types of conditions. Sarah, you had mentioned a litany of items that did prepare the northern RTOs. What do you think about getting an unregulated independent market like ERCOT to kind of see that advantage?
Sure, I think it's a question of understanding the importance that's above and beyond just cost, right? It's important to look at this bigger picture and understand the utilities that operate in that space. Who are they serving? At the end of the day, it's about providing safe and reliable power to their customers. And there's this piece where you have to balance that we're not, it may be difficult and very costly to design for a 100-year storm because you're increasing the amount of money for all of the infrastructure necessary, more steel, more concrete, you name it. On the other hand, we also need to better understand, as we're seeing these extreme weather events that are 100-year storms occurring more frequently. So it's this balance of actually understanding what's happening in the climate, and it's balancing that with the investments that actually need to be made on the system and allowing utilities to make those investments on their system to build that resiliency and to be able to recover those costs.
Yeah, it feels kind of brash, but you get what you pay for, right? It'll be interesting to see as part of that cost component, the capital cost for all the damage that was done. I mean, pipes broken and car accidents and facilities that just were devastated by the results of lack of power, lack of water, pipes freezing, etc. You got to imagine that cost is going to be significantly greater than the cost of what it would have been to winterize these generation plants. When we look at it, you're right, cyclically, with climate, it's changing. Storms are getting more intense, polar vortexes in Texas, wildfires in California, the largest hurricane season ever last year. When you think about a hurricane, how do you plan for a hurricane, right? Same kind of idea. But there is a solution, a viable solution. It might not be the best cost, might not be the cheapest, but there's a solution out there. And I think that there's a really important part to this that speaks to those renewables, because I think you pointed out, Chad, that the renewables were meeting the capacity.
Yeah, not only were they meeting the capacity, but as we look at building new plants and perhaps even retrofitting old plants, the fix for winterizing a wind farm is fairly easy. It's putting a winter package on it. Think of like seat warmers in your car or your vehicle. It's essentially what they're doing for the blades so that they don't ice up. Solar plants tend to do quite well in the winter. I think there's tremendous space for additional renewables to come on the grid. They're the cheapest form of new generation, but it has to be coupled with energy storage solutions at the utility and distribution levels. There's great room for more wind, more solar, and we need a bunch more storage on the system. I'm right there with you. I think it's market reform, it's transmission, but also that energy market reform. It's clear we need a more robust system for emergency availability and readiness. We know there's a scarcity payment mechanism in today's ERCOT energy market, but it clearly didn't hold up in that February 2021 storm.
Yeah, and quite frankly, during a winter storm like that in Texas, you can actually send more electrons through your line because the cold weather provides a natural cooling effect, so it allows more electrons to flow. And if you can do real-time conditions to actually assess how much electricity you can send through that transmission line, you actually can optimize to a much greater extent.
Yeah, Aaron, just with everything that has happened, we're ready to step up and figure out how to be part of the solution. Everybody at Ulteig, we've got colleagues, friends, family members, clients, you name it, that live in the Texas area, call that place home. We're with them during that time in our thoughts.
We've talked a lot today about planning for these types of rare weather events, transmission planning. We've talked about paying for reliability and resiliency of the infrastructure and the grid today. I would just add that it's people we're talking about and people's livelihoods we're talking about. And so that's really what's got to be core to all these decisions that are made around planning and transmission build out and whatever else we're considering in response to this.
Thank you for listening. Share our podcast and don't forget to subscribe to catch our next episode as our series continues to provide in-depth interviews with industry leaders and experts. Check us out at ulteig.com, where we listen, we solve.